So, before James Gunn heads off to head up DC, he's given us one last Marvel adventure of his to enjoy. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And he had quite a task before him. Not only did he have to conclude the story for the team he brought together almost 10 years ago, but he also had to do it by tying together some loose plot threads from different previous movies, some of which weren't even his. He had to give a satisfying story about Peter Quill losing Gamora, but finding a version of her from the past, and he had to give a satisfying follow-up to the promise of Adam. And how does he tie these threads together? With a completely new thread about Rocket's past, and it's pretty clever and well executed. The way all three threads tie together is clever and leads to the classic stuff we all love about the Guardians. Fun creativity, great action scenes, funny moments, character growth, thought-provoking themes, and some deeply rich emotions. We really get to dive into Rocket's mysterious past with our main villain, and see why he is the way he is. It involves some really heavy themes involving animal abuse and the ethics around scientific test subjects. But there's also some very sweet and bittersweet moments with some new characters that make the harder stuff all the more gut-wrenching. I will say, as excellent as it was still a bit unexpected to have Rocket's backstory be such a focal point, since Star-Lord had most of the focus of the first two films. I'm pretty sure I heard that James Gunn at one point had the idea for Rocket's story in this movie to be the main plot of a Rocket and Groot spin-off. Maybe if that had happened, Peter's arc in this could have been fleshed out better, and the trilogy as a whole would feel more cohesively centered around him. Would that have been better? Maybe, maybe not. Who's to say? What we got here is still pretty dang good. One problem though is how his story so heavily involves Gamora, a character who's literally regressed back to who she was at the very start of the first film. And I don't think that was explored as much as it could have been. But that's because there just wasn't time for it. The important part, though, is that it does reach a good conclusion, and Peter at least moves forward as a character. As for the Adam Warlock thing, he seemed to be set up as a much bigger deal, but he ended up being more of a side story. And I mean it when I say side story. He barely interacts with the Guardians, mostly just diving in and out of their story pretty quickly at different points. However, when he does show up to them, he leaves an impact, because he was very well established as a threatening presence while also providing some comic relief. I think most of the heavy lifting in both of those departments is thanks to the eyebrows. Not everyone's going to like it, but I think the job got done, because it really lends credence to what I said earlier about how well all the different plots were weaved together. And in such a smart, fun, funny, and interesting way. I'm telling you, James Gunn has it down to a science at this point. Speaking of science, let's talk about the villain, because he's brilliant. A great example of a mad scientist archetype. And Chukwudi Iwuji plays the part perfectly. At first I thought he was going to play him more like his character from Gunn's other project, Peacemaker. More cold and calculating like he did so well in that. But even though he is that sometimes here, he's also a lot more explosive, having a much bigger tendency to just fly off the handle. And the more I thought about it, the more I appreciated it, because it really made him just like one of those classic mad scientists I was talking about. Just irredeemable and insane. However, that does lead to one problem. The more often he blows up, the less intimidating it feels as the movie goes on. So there are moments where he should be a lot scarier than he comes across. But that problem is not exclusive to him. Except with the other characters, it's more an issue of how the comedy kinda over-relies on how they're blowing up. Because if there's one thing this movie has, it's yelling. Lots of yelling! Yeah, I kinda noticed it in the holiday special last year, and unfortunately it seems to have carried over here. But it feels like with the Guardians characters, James Gunn has kind of fallen back on yelling to make things funny most of the time. The thing is, yelling can be funny. It can be hilarious to watch a character barely hold it in most of the time until they finally snap and just... But if they're yelling all the time, then it's gonna get less funny as it goes and get more annoying. But this nitpick doesn't ruin anything, because there's still plenty of good, classic James Gunn humor to be found elsewhere in the film, and a lot of other versions of James Gunn's unique brands of creativity. Like when it comes to the visuals, there's a lot going on. There's some that are beautiful to look at, and some that are really fun in just how gross they are. He's so good at that. They really got to go all out with the art direction. I mean, sometimes the props and costumes look a little Spy Kids, but that by no means makes it look bad. It's actually kind of ironic because this is pretty mature and graphic for a Marvel movie. I would not take a little kid to see this. because some of the things they show here can be pretty disturbing and intense. Gunn really pushed the PG-13 rating here, and you can tell how bad he wanted to go R. He even got to give Disney's MCU its first F-bomb, which I'm sure he's been begging to do from the very beginning. Maybe they gave it to him to be nice before he leaves. He does really like that word. The effects and the humor aren't the only things that are fun, though. The action sequences are great too, showing off all the characters' cool, unique abilities through some very clearly, carefully planned staging and camera work. The camera work is something to gush about. There's a couple of one-shots that I remember seeing, one that pulls all this weight to establish our characters, and one seriously epic and fun hallway fight. All in all, this movie does exactly what I was wanting it to do, and that's giving this team a sense of finality. It does a great job of showing that our time with this team that's grown and changed over the past decade has come to an end. And each member of the team gets a good, satisfying conclusion. And each one gets at least one moment to set up where they go from here. Personally, I would have liked to have seen more than just one moment of setup for some of these characters' conclusions. But like I've been saying, there's a lot being juggled here. And it's an impressive feat that they were able to make it land at all, much less in such the emotional, fulfilling way that they did. I know it seems like I've nitpicked this movie to death, but that's just because I really like this franchise and hold it to a pretty high standard. Overall, it's a great experience just like its predecessors. I mean, you can tell just from the soundtrack. Part of what's made me so excited for this is seeing what songs I'll finally be able to add to my awesome mix playlist after all these years. And it did not disappoint there. Well, those were just my thoughts after watching this movie. What'd y'all think? Agree? Disagree? Think I'm stupid? Let me know in the comments. And let me know what you thought of this film. As for me, I say Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3? More like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. By the end, you'll swear that you can speak Groot.